Well, thank you, men, for joining us on this adventure as we together get in the Word. Just a few introductory remarks. Some of y'all might have been worried by the stack that I brought in. I just wanted to show you some of the things that might be helpful as we do this study together. The main thing you're going to need are two things. You're going to need this book. And as Ed mentioned, Debbie McCallan has the bookstore open. If you haven't gotten a chance to get a copy of it yet, after we're done, go ahead and grab a copy of this. This is what you're going to be doing during the week. The idea here is not just come and listen, but actually in the week in between to be in the Word yourself. And this little guide, while it's not going to be super in-depth, it's going to give you some basic Bible study approaches. So observation of the text, some reflection questions. What does it say? What does it mean? But then also some theological content to help you understand what you're reading. And then also some personal reflection. One of the things I really like about these 12-week studies is that in a little package, you really do get a lot out of your own personal studies. So this is going to be kind of the spine of what you're going to do, and the idea is that you'll do it before you show up week by week. You'll get more out of what I'm going to say and the discussion around the tables if you do. So you're going to need this, and you're going to need an ESV Bible. Other versions are great to look at, but this Bible study guide booklet goes with the ESV, and so some of the questions as you go through 12 weeks will reflect what you're actually looking at in the ESV version of the Bible. I'd recommend two different study Bibles that'll help you along that line. They both feel like encyclopedias. But one is, if you don't have an ESV study Bible, this is a great reference, came out in 2008. A number of my colleagues at Covenant Seminary were involved, particularly on the Old Testament side. This is really kind of the premier Bible study Bible out there. It's kind of become the gold standard. So if you don't have a copy of the ESV Study Bible, I'd recommend it highly. The other excellent study Bible that just came out in 2015, newly revised, is the Reformation Study Bible that was edited by R.C. Sproul and brought up to date in 2015 with a slew of new notes and theological articles. I had the privilege of working on this as an associate editor. And so both of those would be really helpful because the study notes will not only give you application, but they'll also give you some good explanation of what you're actually reading in the text as you're studying the portion that we have for the week. There's two recommended resources if you want to get them or at least look at them as you're thinking about studying the book of Exodus. By far, the best commentary that I've come across on Exodus is this one. It has a different cover now. Debbie has it in the bookstore. Debbie has all these resources in the bookstore. This is by J. Motier, and it's a commentary on Exodus in the Bible Speaks Today series. What I love about this particular series is that it's easy to utilize, but Motier gives you a lot of content in a short span. And the breakdown chapter by chapter essentially follows the outline that I'm going to give you here today. And so I highly recommend this particular commentary. And then the other thing that has a little bit of a special pride of place in my heart is the Gospel Transformation Bible. This was edited by Brian Chappell. It came out in 2013. They're actually coming out with a revised version of it next year. But part of the reason why I mentioned this to you is that I did the Exodus notes in this. So if you kind of want to sneak preview what I'm likely to say, you may want to look at that. But one of the unique things with that Gospel Transformation Bible is that, as we try to explain when it came out, the ESV Study Bible is really good and heavy on explanation. The Gospel Transformation Study Bible is really meant for application, and particularly, where is Christ in this portion of the Scripture? Or how does this actually motivate obedience with the grace of the gospel? So it really does make a nice complement to a study Bible if you so want to do that. So those are some of the resources that might be helpful for you. You see there on your sheet what's kind of the general outline. What's our plan week by week? Well, we'll start right at 6:30 as we did today with the greeting announcements, whatever announcements there'll be, and then opening prayer. And then by 6:35, hopefully, we'll be in the text, in the Word together. And then 7:05 to 7:10, we'll be wrapping that up, and then we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes of table discussion, which is why we really, the round tables is what we want, and we really would love to have each table full with each guy, because 8 guys, because part of what we're hoping for, what I'm hoping and praying for, is not just that you'll be in the Word, but I mean, as you look around the room, guys, this is kind of unique in the life of IPC, to have a cross-section of generations of men together studying the Word. And so we really hope that relationships will begin to develop around the tables, knowing that as good Presbyterians, you're likely to sit where you sat today for the rest of your life. And so we're hopeful that you'll get to know someone. In fact, one of the things I'm going to challenge you and remind you of as we're wrapping up today, you're going to get everybody's name, and there might be someone at your table that you say, hey, I'd love to go to lunch with you. Exchange cell phone numbers, text, get a time to go to lunch. Because believe it or not, in a church our size, there are guys who are looking to get to know other people, and they can't figure out how to do that. So don't just sit there passive. Get to know each other, reach out to one another, and outside the room, go to lunch, and you might find a new friend. But we're hoping that the table discussion will help both with relationship, but also to discuss what you learned in the given week, but also what you heard today and each subsequent week. Each week I'll ask you a thought question at the end that hopefully will prime you for discussion, and that'll lead you into a discussion time. Right at 7:30, I'll close us in prayer, and you're out the door and off to work. So that's the general outline of what we're hoping to do. You see there a basic schedule for our fall, and the weeks are the weeks in the book. I'm presuming that some of you didn't get the book or didn't know to do anything in advance, which is totally good. And so for next week, I'd encourage you to do both week 1 and 2. Week 1 in the 12-week study guide is an overview. So it's not labor intensive. You could probably knock that one out in a morning. And then you then do week 2, which will prepare you for next Thursday morning. And I'll be talking on the first chapter through the end of chapter 2. And then each week up until the 25th, you'll be working on your book. On October 25th, we're going to have a particular focus on the 10 Commandments. And I'll write a Bible study of four pages worth of, similar to what you have in this booklet. I'm going to write something for you. The way this Bible study book is set up, the 10 Commandments are set rightly within the larger context of God's people being at the foot of Sinai through the end of the book of the covenant and the end of chapter 24. And I think it's really important for us to understand how the 10 Commandments work, particularly in the Christian life. So that's one of the reasons we're going to pull that one out, and I'm going to write something separate for you. And then we'll finish up on November 15th, and there again you'll see weeks 11 and 12 together. And that's because when you look at week 12 in the Bible study guide, it's really kind of a sum of the whole. What'd you learn? What did God show you? How have you changed? Those kinds of questions. So that's kind of the schedule of how we're going to go. Any questions about that? Don't want any confusion. Any questions about any of that introductory stuff? Sir. Thank you. I have that written down. So each week we are videoing the talks because recognize that work intervenes, life intervenes, you may have to go out of town, whatever it may be. 2, we've got other small groups that may not make it on Thursday morning, but they're building their small group around Exodus. And so these will be posted hopefully 24, 48 hours on our YouTube channel. If you just go to YouTube, in the search bar, IPC Memphis, and then click on videos, you'll see it right there at the top in the order. And you can watch week by week. Thank you. Anything else? Okay, so what I want to do this morning is help us as we approach the book of Exodus to ask some really basic questions. And these basic questions aren't just for Exodus. Anytime we approach a book of the Bible, we should be asking these kinds of questions because these questions will help shape our understanding of the book, the kind of literature it is, to whom it's addressed, what's the overarching set of themes that we might find in the book, a particular outline. It'll help set the stage for approaching Exodus or any book of the Bible. And maybe you've tried to study the Bible or read through the Bible and certain books just didn't make sense. I think that's one of the things that people often say when they come to books like Leviticus or Numbers. And they're in a Bible reading plan and they get to those books and they don't make sense. And part of the reason they may not make sense is we don't have the appropriate context for understanding what we're looking at. And so one of the things I do every time I come to a Bible book, particularly to preach and teach, but also when I'm trying to study it and understand it, is to ask some very basic questions about this book so that when I get into it, I can understand what it is I'm looking at. So this morning we're going to ask 4 questions of Exodus that will help us as we approach the book and seek to understand it. First is, who wrote the book of Exodus? Second, what kind of literature is the book of Exodus? Third, whom is Exodus about? And then fourth, what is Exodus about? Okay? So those 4 questions this morning as we come to approach the book of Exodus. So first then, who wrote the book of Exodus? The Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition have both ascribed the authorship of Exodus to Moses, and there are good reasons for us to do that. Unlike, say, New Testament epistles, where you come to Romans, and Romans is self-identifies itself, right? It opens with Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ. Ephesians does the same thing. We have clues within Luke Acts that Luke wrote Luke, and Luke Acts. I mean, so there are books in the Bible where you can either identify based on the very first verses who wrote the book, or there's data within the book that helps you identify it. When you come to Exodus, it simply is picking up from Genesis. That's one of the things I'm going to really point out next week is the tight connection between Genesis and Exodus. And it just continues on in the narrative. And so there's a sense in which Exodus appears to be anonymous. But one of the reasons why we would say with the breadth of the Christian tradition, indeed the breadth of the Jewish tradition for thousands of years that Moses wrote Exodus is because there are explicit references in the text, in Exodus, that tell Moses to write these things down or demands for Moses to write. So hopefully you brought your Bibles with you. We're going to look at some of these places. So turn to Exodus chapter 24. Exodus 24, verse 3, Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules, and all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. So this is the end of the book of the covenant. God has been delivering his law. Moses tells the people all that God has said, all the rules, and he writes them down. So at least chapters 19 to 24, which make up the book of the covenant, the particular section within Exodus, at least we can say Moses wrote that. Okay, but I'm going to say he wrote a lot more than that. Turn over to chapter 34. Verse 28. Actually, we're going to back up to verse 27. This is from 25 to 31. Chapters 25 to 31, God gives instructions regarding the tabernacle. 32 to 34, as we're going to see, is a bit of a intervening scene. That's the golden calf incident, and then Moses interceding for the people. And then God's going to give further instructions, and the building of the tabernacle will start chapters 35 to the end. Right before that, though, chapter 34, verse 27, and the Lord said to Moses, write these words. In accordance with these words, I have made a covenant with you and with Israel. So he was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He neither ate bread nor drank water, and he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. So not just the 10 Commandments, because God's going to give him a lot more to write, but again, you have another instruction from God to Moses to write things down, and Moses writes things down. One other place, God demands Moses to write back in chapter 17, verse 14. So look there, chapter 17. As Israel is fighting Amalek, chapter 17, verse 14, then the Lord said to Moses, write this as a memorial in a book, and recite it in the ears of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Now, there's a lot there, but don't miss, write this as a memorial in the book. God's demanding that Moses write, and so Moses writes. So those are three indications within the book that Moses is the one who has written, if not the entire book, the vast majority of what we find in here. It's notable that in the Gospels that Jesus will refer to Exodus as written by Moses. You have the references there. You don't need to turn to these. I'll read them to you. Mark chapter 12, going back to verse 24, Jesus said to them, is this not the reason you're wrong, because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God? For when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like the angels in heaven. And as for the dead being raised, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the passage about the bush, how God spoke to him, saying, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He's not the God of the dead, but of the living. You are quite wrong. So, of course, the passage about the burning bush, that's Exodus chapter 3. And God through Jesus, the Son of God, says that book, that passage is in the book of Moses. So he attributes Exodus to Moses. He's going to do the same thing, actually, in Mark's gospel, back in chapter 7, Mark chapter 7, verse 10, when he says, for Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. That first one is the fifth commandment. But later, whoever reviles father or mother shall surely die comes from later in the Pentateuch. And Jesus says, Moses said that. Of course, God said it. God's the one who wrote the Ten Commandments ultimately. But Jesus ascribes the writing of it down to Moses. So not only does Exodus identify at certain places that Moses is the author, but Jesus himself calls Moses the author. So why would anyone think that Moses didn't write it? Well, as I've already mentioned, part of it is because the book is anonymous. It doesn't have authorship attributed to it at the beginning. And there are references, not just in Exodus, but in the other part of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, that could not have been written by Moses. For example, Exodus chapter 16 and verse 35. You want to turn there and look at that. This is in the scene in chapter 16 where God provides manna for the people. Exodus 16 verse 35, the people of Israel ate manna 40 years until they came to a habitable land. They ate the manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. When you read the book of Joshua, what you find out is that the manna actually stops when they cross into the promised land. And so some have come to this and said, well, Moses didn't write this because, of course, Moses dies before God's people come into the promised land. He dies on Mount Nebo. Mount Pisgah. So clearly, some critical people would say, Moses didn't write this, so Moses couldn't have written all of Exodus. Simply because there's a later editor who comes and perhaps fashions certain parts or gives explanation doesn't mean that Moses did not essentially write Exodus. There's plenty of indications in the book that say, yes, we believe that Moses wrote it. And so when we ask the question, who wrote Exodus, we would say, Moses wrote Exodus. Now, why is that important? Well, one of the reasons it's important is because many of you have gone to colleges or have children in college in places where the Mosaic authorship of Exodus, indeed of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, is under significant attack. My nephew has just started at Baylor, and he was very, very disappointed as his Bible teacher stood up and began lecturing on the first books of the Old Testament. Lo and behold, God didn't really create the world. Moses didn't really write Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. I mean, all of this is just what's pervade in our culture. But guys, there are good reasons for us to say no. The Bible itself gives us indication that we're not crazy for thinking that Moses wrote the books of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and particularly the book of Exodus. We don't have to be afraid of what critical scholars say. There's indications right in the book he wrote it. So, who wrote the book of Exodus? We say Moses did. What kind of literature is Exodus? When you come to this book, what are you looking at? What's the genre of literature? Well, if you've read the book of Exodus, you know that there's actually all kinds of literature here. There's mainly historical prose. And when we read Exodus, and particularly these historical prose sections, we need to read them with the conventions we're reading historical prose narrative. We don't need to find some kind of allegorical hidden meaning behind historical prose narrative. We read the historical prose narrative of Exodus as historical prose narrative. Even when there's things that might seem supernatural, somewhat fantastic to us, because the text is being written and presenting itself as historical prose narrative, we have to take it on those terms. As an aside, that's what we really mean when we talk about interpreting the Bible, quote unquote, literally. We sometimes use that language. We interpret the Bible literally. I prefer the language, we interpret the Bible in the way that it presents itself to us. And what do I mean by that? Well, when you're dealing with historical prose narrative, whether it's in Exodus or Genesis or Matthew or wherever you go, if you're looking at historical prose narrative, you interpret it as historical prose narrative. That's the way it's presenting itself, and so we need to understand it on those terms. But that's not all there is in Exodus, right? I mean, we know there's legal codes, there are case laws, and the way you interpret legal codes and case laws looks different than historical prose narrative. There are songs in Exodus, most notably the Song of Moses in Exodus 15. When you come to a song or a poem, if you try to interpret it as a historical prose narrative, you're probably not going to fully understand all that's there, because poetry, whether it's in the 2nd century BC or whether it's in second millennium BC or whether it's the second millennium after Christ, we interpret poetry different than historical prose narrative. And so there are songs here. There are also building instructions and execution orders in terms of executing the building plans. In fact, a significant bulk of Exodus is taken up with plans for the tabernacle, all the instructions for the tabernacle, and then the construction of the tabernacle. And we're going to have to ask the question, okay, why is like 13 chapters of Exodus taken up? Why does God think this is so important that he's going to spend so much time talking about this in one of the key books of the Old Testament? But when we come to each kind of literature, whether historical prose narrative or legal code or song and poetry or building instructions, we have to understand them in a particular way and interpret them as they present themselves to us. So again, it's one of the things that as we try to study the Bible and we're in the Word, asking the question, what kind of literature am I looking at? How does it demand to be interpreted is a key question to ask, and then we ask it of Exodus. So Moses wrote it. We're dealing mainly with historical prose narrative. Whom or about whom is Exodus? Who's the central actor? Well, there's a sense in which we could say Moses is, right? He's kind of the key player throughout the book. His birth narrative is going to come right at the beginning. God's going to call him and put him front and center. He's going to be the one before Pharaoh. He's the one doing what God tells him to do. He's the one leading God's people out. The central character at one level, we would say, is Moses. But one of the things I hope to persuade you of, not just with Exodus, but in any portion of the Bible that we study together, is that God's the central actor. He's the Redeemer in Exodus. And he's actually working through Moses in order to accomplish his purpose. And in fact, the good news of Exodus centers just on that point. The good news of Exodus isn't that God raised up Moses and sent Moses off. No, the good news of Exodus is actually that God came down. He actually says that. So look at a couple places with me. Chapter 2, verse 22 to 25. Exodus chapter 2, verse 23. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. That's a turning point because it tells you that God's going to do something about it. In the very next scene in the burning bush, and God's talking to Moses, what does he say? Chapter 3, verse 7. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. So God hears, and God says, I have come down. I've come down to deliver my people. I'm going to use you, Moses, to accomplish my purpose. But who's delivering God's people? God is. And in case we miss it, a central scene is in chapter 7. So turn over there, chapter 7. Key verses are 4 and 5, but let's back up to verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, see, I've made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you. Your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go out of his land, but I will harden Pharaoh's heart. And though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring out my host, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them. So who's delivering God's people? Who's the hero of the story? Who's the Redeemer? Who's the Savior? God is. God is the central actor, the central Redeemer of Exodus. Now, that's certainly true of Exodus, but it's true of every book of the Bible. It's true of Daniel. Who's the main actor in Daniel? It's not Daniel, it's Daniel's God. Who's the main actor in Isaiah? Well, God is. Who's the main actor in the Psalms? Even in poetry, God's the main actor. All along in the Old Testament, what we're paying attention to is what is God doing? What is he up to? How is he delivering his people? How is he seeking to redeem? So that there's a very real sense in which the God who has come to us in Jesus Christ is the main storyline from Genesis to Revelation. In the entire Bible, it's all about him. And so when we come to Exodus, we expect to find the same thing. Now, that's significant because ultimately this God, who is the hero, who's the main actor, he's the redeemer, he comes down bodily, not in Exodus, but in Jesus. And Jesus himself tells the people of his day that if he had simply paid attention to Moses and the other parts of the scripture, that they would certainly have understood who Jesus was and what he had come to do. For example, in John chapter 5, Jesus says, how can you believe when you receive glory from one another and do not seek the glory that comes from the only God? Do not think that I will accuse you to the Father. There is only one who accuses you, Moses, on whom you set your hope. For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? So that Jesus said, Moses wrote of Jesus. Well, how's that the case? Well, it's because Moses wrote of the God who came down to deliver his people, who came down and set his people free and was leading them out of slavery through the wilderness to the promised land. Well, that's exactly what Jesus Christ came to do. And that's why in Luke chapter 24, when Jesus interprets the Bible for his people, Luke 24, verse 27, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. Where did Jesus start? With Moses, with Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, which means that when we come to this book of Exodus, we expect to find that the God who has come to us in Jesus Christ is central to what we're studying. Now, there's 5 themes or patterns among many others that we're going to notice as we go along in our study of Exodus. There are patterns or echoes that will point us ultimately to Jesus. One key theme that we're going to see over and again is covenant. Now, the word covenant is a word that fundamentally means promise. It's a little bit more significant than just like a promise or a pinky promise or a cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye kind of promise. It's a more solemn covenant. It's a bond forged in blood. Particularly in the Old Testament, what you find is covenants are ratified, are sealed by the shedding of blood. We're going to see that as we come to the book of the covenant in Exodus 19 to 24. But God starts his promises really back to Adam, but especially to Abraham. And it's notable in what we've already read in Exodus 2, verses 23 to 25, that when God hears and determines to rescue, to come down, he does so because he's remembering his covenant with Abraham. Did you hear it? Exodus 2, chapter 2, verse 24, God heard their groaning and remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God reached back to those promises that he made. We're going to see this next time. Genesis 15, which is a reiteration of God's covenant with Abraham that he first gives in Genesis chapter 12. In Genesis 15, God's going to say some very specific things to Abraham about what's going to happen to his family. Those things are going to come to fruition here in the book of Exodus. God remembers those promises he made to Abraham and delivers his people as a result. God references that covenant again in Exodus chapter 6. You haven't looked at this yet. You may want to look at it now. Exodus chapter 6 and verse 2. God spoke to Moses and said, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, but by name the Lord I did not make myself known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they lived as sojourners. Moreover, I have heard the groaning of the people of Israel, whom the Egyptians hold as slaves, and I have remembered my covenant. Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land that I swore to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you for a possession. I am the Lord. Did you hear it? 3 different ways God references his covenant that he's made to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. God's remembering his covenant promises. Now, why is that important? Well, it's because covenant is a theme that works its way all through the Bible. So that ultimately, when God comes down in Jesus Christ to rescue you, to deliver you from judgment, to shed blood so that death might pass over you, he does so because he remembers his covenant to Abraham. That's one of the things that Paul says in Romans chapter 4 and in Galatians chapter 3, is that justification, becoming right with God by faith in Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit, the great blessing of the new covenant, both of those blessings come to us because God is remembering his covenant that he's made to Abraham. It's one of the reasons why Genesis chapter 12 is so significant in understanding the story of the Bible. God responds by keeping his promises that he has made. Covenant is a key theme throughout the Bible, and we're going to see it again and again here in this book of Exodus. Another theme, though, another pattern, another echo that will find fulfillment in Jesus is redemption through blood. As you know, the central story of Exodus is the Passover, so that finally God delivers his people, and he does so through the angel of death, the angel of judgment, is going to come and strike the firstborn. And by the death of spotless lambs, the blood will be applied. The angel of death will pass over the houses that have the blood, and then God's people are set free. There's redemption from slavery through the blood of spotless lambs. Of course, we know that's going to find its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus Christ. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 7. In him you have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of trespasses. Or 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 18 and 19. You've not been redeemed with corruptible things, such as silver and gold, but with the precious blood of Christ. Or 1 Corinthians 5, verse 7, that Jesus is our Passover lamb. He's our paschal lamb. He's the one whose blood was shed so that we might be redeemed. Over and again, the idea of redemption through blood that we find in the New Testament, it has its anchoring or its foreshadowing in this story of Exodus, and particularly the Passover. So we're going to see that again. Another theme we're going to see is dwelling. God dwelling in the midst of his people. And dwelling is actually a key theme of the entire Bible, all the way back. In Genesis, when God makes the world, he makes it as a cosmic temple in which he might dwell with his people. How do we know that? Because in Genesis chapter 3, after Adam and Eve sin, what do we find? God's walking in the garden in the cool of the day. That was his custom. God meant to dwell in a world that was made as a place for his presence with his people, that we might reflect his glory. And even though Adam and Eve sin and they're thrust out of that garden, there's a sense in which God's promise is over and again iterated, that I'm going to dwell in your midst. I'm going to be in the midst of my people. I'm going to enjoy fellowship with them. I'm going to dwell. So key in Exodus is going to be the tabernacle. As I've already mentioned, almost 13 chapters deal with some aspect of this tabernacle. Well, what is the tabernacle? It's the place of God's dwelling. Where is it? It's in the middle of the camp. So that Israel camps around the tabernacle. They're arranged around the tabernacle. And who's in the center of the camp? God is. He's the one dwelling in their midst. The Shekinah glory of God comes down and fills the tabernacle. And then when he when he decides to leave and go on the march, he's in the cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night, and he leads his people. And when they come to their next stop, they set it all up. They set up camp, and God comes and dwells in the midst of his people again. But then fast forward to the temple. In the center of Israel is Jerusalem. The center of Palestine is Jerusalem. God claims that city as his own. And in the center of Jerusalem is what? It's the temple. And when Solomon dedicates the temple, what happens? The Shekinah glory of God comes so that the priests couldn't do their work because God dwells in the midst of his people. So fast forward to the New Testament. And when you read John's gospel, as you know from Christmas sermon after Christmas sermon, John 1:14, the Word became flesh and dwelt, that word is tabernacled, among us, so that in Jesus Christ, God fulfills that promise to dwell in the midst of his people. Of course, Jesus is now ascended with the Father. There's a yet greater promise at the end of Scripture. In Revelation 21 and 22, there is no temple in the new heavens and new earth. Why? God is the temple. We dwell in him. We see him face to face, never to be separated again. So that the promise from Genesis to Revelation is that God will dwell in the midst of his people and it will come to fruition. So Exodus is a key stop along the way of the development of that theme with this idea of the tabernacle. And we're going to see that more clearly as we study it together. Two other themes more briefly. One is wilderness, water, and promised land. God's people are going to leave Egypt. They're going to be in the wilderness. And eventually, they're going to cross the river Jordan and enter into the promised land. That's a theme within the Pentateuch that part develops here. But Jesus is going to do the same thing. Remember? Where is he tempted? Matthew chapter 4. He's tempted in the wilderness. He comes across the river Jordan and enters into the promised land to do his work. But ultimately, he's going to take us that way. Because we dwell here in the midst of a wilderness. We cross the river death. We're brought into the promised land to dwell with God forever. So that you have these patterns that develop and find their place and their rootedness here in Exodus. And then two, a final theme of redemption and response. We're not simply redeemed from slavery, we're redeemed for God. So the movement, and particularly we'll see this with the Ten Commandments, the movement is God redeems and then demands a response. There's grace, and then there's law. We tend to reverse the order. We tend to say, oh no, I need to obey, and then I'll get grace. I need to perform, and then I'll know God's pleasure. I need to respond in order to be redeemed. No, that's completely backwards. No, God is the one who moves towards us. He's the one who delivers. He's the one who comes down. He's the one who redeems. And then we respond by obedience. So these are some of the things we'll notice. There will be others that I'll point up along the way. But that's about whom Exodus is. Exodus is about God, who has come as the central actor to redeem his people. Finally, what is Exodus about? There you have an outline that really does emphasize God's action. Your study guide will have its own outline, which is fine. But this outline that I did for the Gospel Transformation Bible really tries to emphasize the fact that God is the main actor. So God is the one who hears and remembers his covenant. That'll be the section you'll study this week, chapters 1 and 2. And then God comes down and calls his deliverer, Moses, as his mediator. God is the one who redeems his people from chapter 4, middle of chapter, toward the end of chapter 4, that should be, through chapter 15. And how does God redeem? He redeems through his promise. He redeems through his plagues. He redeems through his Passover, and he redeems through his power. God's the one who leads his people. That section at the end, beginning at the end of chapter 15, running to the end of chapter 18, you'll see three tests that deal with water, bread, and water. As God's people test God in the wilderness, God will not only deliver them, he will ultimately be the one who is struck in order to deliver. And then finally, God instructs his people, and that will be particularly through commandments, covenant, and tabernacle. And that will be at the base of Sinai. So that the movement in Exodus is going to be from Egypt through the Red Sea to Sinai. And half the book will actually be at the mountain of Sinai. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an orientation. It was a little bit longer than what we'll do normally, but I knew that you hadn't studied anything to talk about around the tables. Let's take the last 10 minutes. I want you to do two things. I want you to introduce yourselves to one another, because undoubtedly there's going to be someone at your table who doesn't know who you are, or vice versa. And then answer this question for each other. What is one thing, whether it's an insight or a direction for your life or a correction or an encouragement, what's one thing that you hope to get from studying Exodus this fall? Okay, so take 10 minutes around the tables, introduce yourself. What's one thing you hope to get from this study?